All right, let's go. Number 10. The Masks of Mycenae. In the autumn of 1876, Heinrich Schliemann was cutting trenches inside the citadel of Mycenae under a Greek government permit, watched at every step by a state antiquities official named Panagiotis Stamatakis. Below the surface, he found a ring of upright stone slabs. Inside it were shaft graves cut deep into the rock and sealed. He cleared 5 before the year ended. A 6th turned up the following November after he had gone home. The graves held 19 bodies. They also held more gold than anybody expected from Bronze Age Greece. Diadems, drinking cups, sword hilts, and sheets of gold beaten into the shape of a human face. 5 gold masks came out of grave circle A. 3 from the 4th shaft grave, 2 from the 5th. They were lying on the heads of the dead. The one now called the Mask of Agamemnon was lifted from the 5th grave on the 30th of November, and it is in Athens today. It weighs 168.5 grams. The metal was hammered from a single sheet over a solid mold, probably wooden, and the details were chased in afterwards with pointed tools. That sequence matters more than it sounds. A mask pressed onto a dead face carries that face. This one could not have been. The sheet is too thick to take an impression from skin, and the eyebrows, the beard, and the closed eyelids were cut into the gold after the shape already existed. There are small holes at the sides. Thread ribbon or nails passed through them, holding the gold against the wrappings or the coffin. So the face was fixed on. It was not taken off anybody. Confirmation arrived 75 years later. A second grave circle was found outside the citadel wall in 1951, and a mask of electrum came out of it. It was not on the man's face. It lay beside him in a wooden box. But here is where the object stops behaving like a portrait. Grave circle A dates to roughly 1600 to 1500 BC. The traditional date for the fall of Troy is 1184 BC. Whatever this gold covered had been in the ground 3 or 4 centuries before the war it is named after was supposed to have begun. The name is modern, and so is most of the story attached to it. Schliemann never wrote the sentence everybody quotes. No letter and no telegram has him gazing upon the face of Agamemnon. And the archaeologist Leslie Fitton traced the phrase and found nothing behind it. What he actually wired to the Greek press was that a corpse resembled the image his imagination had formed of a Homeric king. He was describing a different body under a different mask. The gold has been handled since as well. In the earliest photograph, the ears are folded inward, and they were opened out during restoration. The upturned tips of the mustache are not clearly there in that first image either, and became prominent only after a restoration around 1889. William Calder and David Trail argued that the whole thing was forged or altered to order. That case has not been accepted. The mask was lifted under Greek state supervision, and its beard is worked in the same manner as a gold lion's head from the same grave, which points to a workshop rather than a hoaxer. What is left is stranger than a forgery, and more unsettling. An object made to cover a face nobody would ever see again, restored by people who wanted it to look like a king, and named after a man who may never have existed. It is one of the most haunting things in European archaeology, and almost nothing said about it is secure. The gold is exactly what it was in 1876. Everything attached to it, since including the sentence we all quote, was added by the living. Number 9. The stone faces that cannot see. A Teotihuacan mask in a museum case reads instantly as a portrait. Broad cheeks, a wide level mouth, open eyes under a flat brow, and stone polished until it holds the light. Then the problem appears. The eyes are not holes. In 2018, Timothy Rose and Jane McLaren Walsh published a study of 121 of these stone faces in collections across North America and Europe. They measured them, identified the rock, and worked out how they were made. The materials are travertine limestone, serpentinite, and a rare altered serpentinite called lystwanite. None of those stones outcrop within 50 kilometers of Teotihuacan. Everyone was carried in. The faces run from 9 to 28 centimeters tall, and most weigh between 3 and 7 kilograms. In the author's own words, they have no openings for seeing, speaking, or breathing. The eye sockets in the mouth were drilled at the corners at an angle and not to open them. The angled holes key in inlay. Shell for the white of the eye. Pyrite or obsidian for the pupil. Something dark for the mouth. The face was made to be looked at. It was never made to be looked out of. Rose and Walsh put it without hedging. These objects would not have been worn as masks by living humans. They do not fit a face, and they are too heavy to hold up. What they do have is holes around the edge at the temples, beside the ears, under the chin. The Walters Art Museum describes 4 drill holes anchoring its example, and the Metropolitan Museum notes that perforations on another's reverse suggest it was meant to be fixed to something. That something has not survived. The reading most museums give is that these faces were the durable component of a figure made mostly of perishable material, a wooden or ceramic effigy, a funerary bundle with a head that needed a front. The stone was the part chosen to outlast the body. What makes this hard to test is that almost none of them can be traced to a grave, a floor, or an offering. Rose and Walsh describe hundreds in museums and private collections, and only a few dozen documented to any archaeological context at all. Of 51 faces in the National Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City, only 14 have a specific find location, and 6 of those came from somewhere other than Teotihuacan. The rest arrived through the antiquities market, which records nothing on purpose. That is the quietly disturbing thing about this category of object. Almost everything known about it comes from pieces whose burial context was destroyed to get them out of the ground. The exceptions are few. A finished limestone face was recovered, lying face down on a floor in the Tlaxcala district. Ignacio Bernal excavated a fragment of a colossal Listwanite face in front of the Pyramid of the Sun, big enough to reconstruct at 57 centimeters. And in 2011, a team under Alejandro Sarabia reached bedrock 85 meters inside a tunnel beneath that same pyramid. A foundation offering laid down around AD 50 held a serpentine mask 11 centimeters high, weighing just over a kilogram, its eyes inlaid with shell and pyrite. That offering is an extraordinary piece of luck. The mask in it is also atypical. Small, unusually three-dimensional, and centuries older than most of the faces in museum cases. Rose and Walsh reject the funerary bundle reading altogether. They argue the faces were centerpieces of large ritual constructions handled by the living, closer to an incense burner than to a coffin. That is a recent position and a minority one. So we are left with several hundred stone faces, cut from imported rock, drilled for inlay they no longer hold, and pierced at the edges for lashings that rotted. We know they were tied to something. We know that something was wood or cloth or a body. The face outlasted whatever it was the face of, which is precisely what it was chosen to do. Number 8. The false heads of Pachacamac. On the desert coast of Peru, the dead were not laid flat. They were folded knees, drawn to the chest arms, bound sometimes with a gourd bowl tucked beneath the chin, and then they were wrapped. Plain cotton first. Then tunics, mantles, headcloths coarse, weave over fine layer after layer, until the body vanished inside a cone of textile wider and taller than the person had ever been. A single bundle can hold dozens of objects, and the richest run past 200. The result is called a fardo, a bundle. And at the top of the bundle, where a head should be, the wrappers built something that was not a head. Rommel Angelis Falcon's study of the false heads from Pachacamac describes them exactly. They are carved woodcut and shaved and incised and painted 12 to 30 centimeters long, trapezoidal or squared off at the edges. The eye sockets are rectangular. The noses are aquiline. The mouths are a single incised line. Shell was set into the eyes, sometimes painted black, and most of the faces carry a thin coat of red, either iron oxide or cinnabar. Then a wig was added, made of human hair with camelid fiber worked through it. They belong to the Middle Horizon, roughly the 6th to the 11th centuries AD. And they are the reason a Peruvian mummy bundle photographs the way it does. Without the face, it is a sack. With it, the sack is looking at the camera. Behind that wooden face, there is no room for anybody. The head is a mass of raw cotton and plant fiber packed around a cane, or a wooden armature at the apex of the bundle. There is no strap. There is no rim, no hollow, nothing to breathe through, and nothing to see through. The only human material in it is the hair. Krzysztof Makowski of the Pontifical Catholic University of Peru reported 73 burials, with false heads of carved wood and ceramic at Pachacamac, associated with the Wari horizon and dating to somewhere around AD 800 to 1100. This was not one family's idea. It was how an important person was finished. So why give a sealed bundle a face at all? Except the bundles were not sealed. Peter Eekhout and Lawrence Owens published a study in 2014 on the chronology and rewrapping of funerary bundles at Pachacamac. Bundles were opened. They were added to and closed again, sometimes long after the first wrapping. The dead at that sanctuary were not put away once and forgotten. They were maintained over years by people who had to keep looking at them. A face makes that possible. It gives the bundle a front, a direction, a place to hang a headdress, and a point to speak towards. The unsettling part is how well it works. Set a carved face on a cone of cloth, and the cone stops being an object. It becomes somebody sitting down. The version most people have seen is later. On the same coast, the Shanke, between about AD 1000 and 1470, produced false heads that are almost cartoonishly direct. A flat carved face, painted red with cinnabar. Wide shell eyes. A wig of real human hair confirmed by microscopic analysis of one example in the Walters Art Museum in 2017. Thousands of these bundles were pulled apart by looters across the 20th century, and the wooden faces traveled better than the bodies did, which is the disturbing reason so many of them now sit in collections with no record of who they belong to. What the face meant is inference. What it did is observable, and it is the part we can be certain about. These are not portraits taken from the dead. They are faces carved by somebody else fitted to a bundle after the person inside had already been folded up and tied, and positioned so that the living had somewhere to direct their attention. The wood survives. The wig survives, still parted still, holding its color in a museum drawer. Inside the textile, the body is a skeleton pulled into a crouch, its own face covered by a pad of cotton and a plain cloth. The face the world was given to look at was never that person's face at all. Number 7. The masks buried in graves with no bodies. In October 1972, an excavator operator named Rachel Marinov was cutting a trench for an electrical cable through the industrial zone west of Varna on the Bulgarian Black Sea coast. The bucket brought up metal. He took some of it home in a shoebox before anybody official saw it. What he had opened was a cemetery in use around 4,600 to 4,300 BC. Excavation ran for 13 seasons, first under Mihail Lazarov and then under Ivan Ivanov. 294 graves were cleared. Between them, they held roughly 3,000 gold objects, weighing something close to 6 kilograms, the largest assemblage of worked gold known from anywhere on Earth at that date. Perhaps a third of the cemetery is still in the ground. Grave 43 gives the scale. A man of about 40 to 45, between 1.70 meters and 1.75 meters tall, laid out with 990 gold objects on and around him, 1.5 kilograms in total. Heavy gold rings on both arms. A scepter sheathed in gold. A gold sheath made for the penis. Then there are graves 2, 3, and 15. They are among the richest in the cemetery, and they contain no bodies at all. In each of them, the excavators found a human face modeled in clay, unfired or barely fired, lying in the earth of an empty grave. The face from grave. 2 measures, 20 by 19.5 centimeters. The one from grave 3 measures 21 by 18. The gold on them is placed with anatomical care. Round gold plates for the eyes, a rectangular gold plate for the mouth, and driven into the clay beneath it, 7 small gold nails standing where teeth would stand, a gold diadem across the forehead, 5 earrings at the left ear of one face and 3 at the right, 2 gold amulets at the throat. What makes these graves difficult is the arithmetic. They are cenotaphs, empty by design, and they were given more gold than most of the graves that held a person. Whatever a body was worth in this society, an absence could be worth more. The obvious explanation is substitution. A burial for someone whose body could not be brought back from a raid, a voyage, a drowning, an accident far from home. A clay face standing in for a face nobody could recover. That reading is reasonable, and it may well be correct. But nothing in the grave says so. There is no text. There is no image of the rite. There is a modeled face, a set of gold ornaments arranged in the order of a living head, and a hollow where a person should be lying. The effect in a museum case is genuinely unsettling because the display looks complete and the person is simply not in it. Maria Gimbutas proposed something else, that these were ritual tombs for a goddess of regeneration, buried so that she could be reborn. That interpretation is around 50 years old. It predates most of the excavation, and no consensus has formed behind it. Both readings are guesses about intention, and we have only the same three objects to test them against. What is not a guess is the deliberateness. Somebody modeled a face out of river clay. Somebody laid gold on it in the correct anatomical positions, including 7 separate nails for the teeth. The community then buried it at the highest rank available to them, and did the same thing at least 3 times. Nobody does that once by accident. Around 4300 BC, the world that produced this comes to an end. The settlements go quiet. The metalworking tradition breaks off, and gold does not appear again at that scale in the region for a very long time. Why it stopped has never been established with any confidence. And for a society that had invented something extraordinary, the disappearance is remarkably complete. 3 faces were made of mud by people who had gold and knew exactly what to do with it. Their mouths are marked out in metal. 7 nails stand in for a set of teeth that were never in the ground. Whoever the faces were made for never arrived. Number 6. The Chinchorro masks. The coast of the Atacama is one of the driest places on the planet, and in parts of it rain is measured in decades. Behind the beach, the ground is salt and sand, and nothing rots the way it should. People lived along that shoreline on fish, shellfish, and sea lion for thousands of years, and left almost no architecture. What they left was their dead, and their dead had been taken apart and put back together. The oldest artificially mummified body known anywhere is a child from the Camerones Valley, south of Arica, dating to roughly 5050 BC. That is around 7,000 years ago, well over 1,000 years before anything comparable from Egypt. Max Uhl described those burials scientifically for the first time in 1917 and 1918. The earliest and most elaborate method began by dismantling the body. The head, the arms and the legs were detached. The flesh was cut away. The bones were dried with heat, and some still carry scorch marks from it. The organs and the brain were removed. Then, the skeleton was rebuilt. Sticks and reeds were lashed along the limbs and spine to hold everything rigid. The cavities were restuffed with grass, ash soil, and animal hair, and the skin refitted over the top, patched with sea lion hide where it was missing. The whole figure was then modeled over in clay and ash paste, and painted black with manganese. And over the face went a mask. A separate application of fine pale paste, smoothed and shaped, with the eyes and the mouth cut into it. The mouths are usually modeled open. A wig of human hair was fixed on with the same paste, and some of those wigs run to nearly 60 centimeters. But here is where the practice stops resembling a funeral. In 2015, Marcela Sepulveda and colleagues put 2 samples from a single Chinchorro mummy through electron microscopy and X-ray diffraction. They found 5 superimposed coating layers, each a clay matrix carrying manganese minerals, each different from the last, and trapped between the layers pigment from a surface that had been covered over. The outside of that body had been repaired and repainted more than once, each coat laid over one that had already dried hard. That cannot be done to something in the ground. The authors concluded that these bodies were not buried when the work was finished. They were kept, carried, handled, propped upright, and painted again when the paint went. The evidence is narrow, 2 samples from one individual, and not a survey of a population. But it fits everything around it. Mummies with the outer coating worn through to the gray clay underneath. Internal reinforcements broken and then repaired. Wear of the kind objects take when they are used rather than stored. The quietly terrifying part of that picture is not the dismemberment. It is the maintenance. Somebody kept touching up the paint. Why any of it began is unresolved. Bernardo Arriaza of the Universidad de Tarapacá proposed an environmental trigger. The river water at Camerones carries about 1,000 micrograms of arsenic per liter, 100 times the World Health Organization guideline, and chronic exposure has been measured directly in hair from these populations. High exposure raises the rate of miscarriage and infant death. Arriaza's argument is that a community burying an unusual number of babies may have begun by refusing to let them go. The earliest artificial mummies are in fact infants and small children. The problem is that only half of that is measurable. The arsenic is a number. The grief is not, and Arriaza is careful to call his own idea a testable hypothesis with more than one cause behind it. The arsenic is still in the water. The newer threat is the air. Since the early 2000s, mummies in the collection at the Universidad de Tarapacá have started breaking down into a black slime. In 2015, a team including Ralph Mitchell at Harvard identified the cause. Not an exotic organism, ordinary skin bacteria, the kind that live on all of us, harmless on those bodies for 7,000 years, and destructive once relative humidity climbs past about 60%. The masks came through the driest desert on Earth intact. They are not coming through the change in the weather, and the coastline you can fly into today is already humid enough to dissolve them. Number 5. The bronze faces of Sanxingdui. In the summer of 1986, workers digging clay for a brick factory near Guanghan in Sichuan struck something hard. On the 18th of July, they exposed the first pit. On the 16th of August, about 30 meters away, they exposed a second. Inside were hundreds of bronzes belonging to a tradition Chinese archaeology had no category for. Radiocarbon dates place the deposits in the late Shang period somewhere between roughly 1200 and 1000 BC. 6 further pits were located in 2019 and excavated between 2020 and 2022 by the Sichuan Provincial Cultural Relics and Archaeology Research Institute, together with more than 30 partner institutions. The 8 pits have now produced something in the order of 13,000 objects. Among them are the faces. One of the masks lifted in 1986 is about 1.5 meters across and 66 centimeters high. Its ears extend outward, like wings as much as 70 centimeters. Its pupils are cylinders projecting 16 centimeters straight out of the sockets. Another raised from Pit 3, in June 2021, measures 131 centimeters wide, 71 high, and 66 deep, and weighs 65.5 kilograms. The Sanxingdui Museum states the position without decoration. They are called masks, but they are too big to be worn on a human face, because most of them are more than 1 meter wide. What they were fixed to is a separate question. The large masks carry squared openings at the center of the forehead and at the sides of the face. Silk residues were recovered near those openings on the pit. 3 mask. The museum's suggestion is that they were mounted on something architectural, a pillar or a wall or a timber frame. That is a hypothesis built on a set of holes. Nobody has excavated the thing they were fixed to. The truly disturbing part is what was done to them before they went into the ground. They were destroyed first. The bronzes were burned and broken deliberately, then buried. Analysis of the pit fill published in 2023 put the burning at 600 to 800 degrees Celsius. 7 of the 8 pits contained a layer of scorched elephant tusks. The fill is ash and charcoal, and the remains of burnt bamboo, reed rice, and millet. In several pits, the deposition is ordered rather than dumped. Bronze is low down, and ivory laid above them. This was not rubbish disposal. Faces were smashed, set on fire, and buried in sequence by people who knew exactly what they were destroying. Gold appears as well. A broken gold mask came out of Pit 5 in 2021, weighing about 280 grams at roughly 84% gold. Complete, it would have passed 500 grams. Gold foil masks have also been found still adhering to bronze heads. 4 of the 57 heads recovered, cut to the outline of the bronze, and stuck down with an adhesive of lime and lacquer. So, a bronze head could be given a gold face. and then the whole assembly could be broken and burned. No writing has been found at Sanxingdui, not in the pits, not anywhere on the site. Shang oracle bones mention a polity called Shu, but whether that Shu is this place is contested, and nothing recovered from the pit settles it. Why they were filled remains open. The leading interpretation is sacrificial deposition supported by the burning, the ordering, and the sheer scale. Others argue that sacrifice on this scale would have taken place in a temple or a dedicated ritual ground, and that the pits are only where the remains were shoveled afterwards. One of the excavators has said plainly that whether this was the closing act of a ritual or a response to an emergency is not something the evidence can decide. Both readings share one extraordinary implication. A community capable of casting a face 1.5 meters wide chose to break it, burn it, and bury it, and then never made another. What survives is a set of faces with rectangular eyes and pupils that stand out from the head like the ends of telescopes, made by people who worked bronze and gold at a scale nobody suspected existed in Sichuan. We can measure the temperature of the fire that scorched them. We can date the ash and count the tusks. We cannot read a single word those people wrote, because not one word of it has ever been found. Number 4. The mask painted with human blood. In 2021, a chemistry laboratory at the University of Oxford took a sample of red paint weighing a few milligrams and ran it through 3 separate analyses. The paint had come off a gold funerary mask from the north coast of Peru. It was about 1,000 years old, and it was still firmly attached to polished metal, which is not what a 1,000-year-old paint layer normally does. The pigment itself was already known. Cinnabar mercury sulfide, identified by X-ray diffraction more than 30 years earlier, and confirmed afterwards by portable X-ray fluorescence. The open question was what the cinnabar had been mixed with to make it hold. The mask came from a shaft tomb at Huacaloro in the Poma forest of the La Leche Valley, excavated between October 1991 and March 1992. By a project directed by Izumi Shimada, the shaft dropped about 11 or 12 meters to a chamber roughly 3 meters square. The Middle Sican period runs from about AD 900 to 1100, and this tomb sits near the middle of it. The principal occupant was a man of 40 to 50. He was seated. He was upside down. His head had been detached from his body and rotated through 180 degrees, so that it sat the right way up facing west, while the rest of him did not. His body was painted with cinnabar. Over his face lay a gold mask, 46 by 29 centimeters, weighing 677 grams. About half gold, a third silver, the rest copper. It carried a 3-dimensional bat's head on the forehead, and 15 gold discs hung beneath it. Around him were roughly 1.2 tons of grave goods. 2 young women lay with him, their skeletons arranged in the postures of childbirth and of a midwife attending it. 2 children had been placed at a higher level in the chamber. The arrangement is the most disturbing thing in the tomb, and it is also the part that is pure observation. The bones are where they are. What the positioning was for is a separate argument entirely. What makes this tomb different from almost every other Sican tomb is that it was excavated rather than looted, which meant the paint on the mask had a documented history and could be treated as evidence. The 2021 analysis, published by Elisabetta Pires, Izumi Shimada, and James McCullough in the Journal of Proteome Research, found protein in the red layer. 3 human blood proteins, serum albumin, immunoglobulin G, and an immunoglobulin chain. Alongside them proteins from bird egg, ovomucoid, ovotransferrin, vitellogenin, and 1 surviving fragment of ovalbumin. The red was cinnabar bound in blood and egg. The bird cannot be identified. The proteins are too degraded, and the chicken sequences that matched the reference database can be ruled out on archaeological grounds. Because chickens arrived in the Americas with Europeans, the Muscovy duck is the plausible local candidate. The authors say that much, and nothing more. What the mixture meant is inference, and they are careful with it. Red cinnabar has long been read in Andean archaeology as an image of blood and of vital force. The paint on this mask turned out to contain actual blood. The man beneath it had been inverted between 2 women, posed as though a birth were underway. The researchers suggest the intended effect was rebirth. That is an interpretation resting on a body position and a pigment, and it is offered as a suggestion rather than a finding. Here is what we can measure. A layer of paint, 1 to 2 millimeters thick, held to gold for 1,000 years by proteins from a human being and a bird, covering the face of a man who had been taken apart and reassembled facing the wrong way round. Somebody bled into a pot of mercury ore and stirred, and the mixture is still doing its job. And then there is the consequence nobody planned. Sickened gold masks are scattered through private collections and museum cases, and most of them came out of the ground through looting, which destroyed the record of where they lay and who they lay on. This mask has a documented excavation and now a measured protein signature. It has become the reference the unprovenanced ones can be tested against. That is the haunting part of the result. 1,000 years after somebody mixed human blood into that paint. The blood is what makes the object admissible. Number 3, the bodies that were rebuilt to wear them. Above the Yenisei River in southern Siberia, at a place called Oglokty Red, sandstone cliffs come down to the water. The graves cut into the slope beneath them are timber-lined chambers, and the cold and dryness inside a few of them have preserved things that ought not to still exist. Alexander Adrianov opened 17 of those graves in 1903. 3 still held organic material. Leonid Kislesov returned in 1969, at the start of a campaign that ran on to 1973, and opened grave number 4. Inside were 2 adults, a man and a woman mummified each with a painted plaster mask over the face and ears. A child lay with them. Beside them lay 2 more figures, roughly human in shape, dressed in clothing. They were not people, they were mannequins. The bodies of the mannequins are tightly twisted plates of cereal stalks, covered over with leather and sewn shut. Into the chest of each one through a slit cut for the purpose. Somebody had inserted a leather case. Inside the cases were burnt human bones. The slits were stitched closed over them. Each mannequin wore a mask of its own. Read that sequence again. A person was cremated. The bones were collected, bagged in leather, and pushed into the chest of a straw doll. The doll was dressed, given a face, and laid in a grave beside 2 people who had been preserved whole. It is one of the most unsettling funerary arrangements ever excavated in Siberia, and it was not a one-off. The masks are gypsum plaster, built up in layers. A coarse mix of plaster, with limestone and quartz sand, applied a little at a time. Finished with a thin, pure coat and then painted. The grave 4 masks carry red and black patterning, made from iron oxide and charcoal. The tallest stands about 20 centimeters. Work by Svetlana Pankova and colleagues at the Hermitage separates 2 kinds. Masks from ground burials were laid directly onto the face of the dead thin, following the bone underneath. Masks from collective vault burials are thicker. Those were formed over leather head forms because there was no face left to form them on. And then there is what a CT scanner found inside the man from grave 4. He had a hole in his left temple hidden under the mask. The woman beside him had a larger and rougher opening at the back of her head. The scan showed his had been made deliberately by repeated blows from a chisel or a hammer, in a manner consistent with removing the brain. It also showed a wound running from his left eye to his left ear that had been sewn shut after he died. It was stitched, the researchers suggest, so that the plaster would sit correctly on his face. And it showed tattoos the first ever found on a Tashtyk body. Somebody repaired that man's face, so the mask would fit. It is a small, careful, horrifying detail, and it tells us more about the practice than the measurements do. Radiocarbon wiggle matching on the timbers of grave 4 gives 2 possible windows, the later 3rd century, or the end of the 4th, with the later one favored. There is a pattern in who was treated which way. At Oglokty, every cremation that could be sexed was male. Most of the people buried whole were female. What that pattern means has not been established. Kislesov read the mannequin rite as 2 traditions grafted together, cremation arriving from outside and dressed up to resemble the local practice of burying a body whole. Pankova has raised the possibility that it marks 2 populations living side by side. Ancient DNA from Tashtyk graves shows mixed Western and Eastern Eurasian ancestry. which is consistent with that idea, and on its own proves nothing. The Tashtyk left no writing. What survives of them is a face, or rather a few hundred fragments of faces in Russian museum collections, with a couple of dozen restored whole. Some of those faces were taken from the skin of a specific dead person, close enough to record a healed wound and the line of a jaw. Others were shaped over a leather dummy stuffed with straw, holding the burnt bones of somebody whose face had already gone into the fire. Both kinds look out with the same painted expression. From the front, there is no way to tell one from the other. Number 2. The ivory faces of Point Hope. Point Hope is a gravel spit on the Chukchi Sea coast of northwest Alaska, thrown out into the water at the place where the whales pass. The Inupiat name for it is Teotihuacan, and it is one of the longest continuously occupied settlements in North America. People live there now. In 1939, an archaeological survey found the outline of something enormous under the tundra. Helge Larsen of the Danish National Museum and Froelich Rainey, then at the University of Alaska, mapped the old beach ridges with a plane table and counted around 575 house depressions. Excavation followed in 1940 and 1941. They dug more than 70 houses and 176 graves, and named the site and the culture Teotihuacan. The finds did not match the coastline they came out of. No pottery, no oil lamps, and no evidence of whaling at one of the best whaling locations in the Arctic. What there was instead was carving. Walrus ivory worked to a standard the region never matched again. Openwork panels, animal figures, spirals, and interlocking links. Close to 100 pieces of the kind usually described as shamanic equipment. And there was what these people did to faces. In several graves, separate pieces of ivory had been placed on the head of the dead, carved plugs for the nostrils, covers laid across the mouth in burials 841 and 61. In burial 51, artificial eyes, spool-shaped ivory set with pupils of jet. Each piece on its own looks like an ornament. Laid out together, they stop looking like ornaments. In 2 of the graves, the pieces are not separate objects at all. Burial 64 held 9 pieces of carved ivory found in a heap. Assembled, they stand 16.4 centimeters high, and they make a face. Burial 77 held 7 pieces plus eyes of jet, and those were found in position. They lay over the body of a child. The child lay between the knees of an adult male skeleton. The ivory had been fastened to a backing of wood, and the wood was gone, reduced to a brown stain in the gravel. Larsen and Rainey did not call these masks. They called them mask-like sets of carvings, which is both more accurate and more unsettling. A mask is one object that goes over a face. This is a face broken into components and reassembled on somebody who was in no position to refuse it. Why the eyes and the mouth were covered is inference, and the honest version of the answer is short. Nobody knows. The pieces are usually described as protective. William Fitzhugh has pointed out that Iputak eye coverings with large open holes would have been useless against snow glare, and suggested the holes were meant to be plugged to block the sight of the dead rather than to guard it. He presents that as speculation, and anybody repeating it should do the same. We do not know whether these objects were meant to hold something in or keep something out. The cemetery is out of proportion to the settlement it belongs to. The living population is estimated at 125 to 200 people at any one time in 20 or 30 houses. The graves accumulated across 3 or 4 centuries, and the main occupation now looks like the middle of the first millennium AD. Nothing about that is a lost city. It is a small community on a gravel bar that spent an extraordinary share of its skilled labor on the dead, in a place where every hour of daylight had to be paid for in food. Those dead were excavated at a time when consent was not part of the process. In August 1996, the Smithsonian returned the remains of about 354 individuals, along with funerary objects, to the native village of Point Hope. Teotihuacan is not a vanished civilization. It is a village that inherited a museum problem it had no part in creating. The ivory is still bright. Walrus tusk does not gray the way bone does, and the jet pupils still take a shine under glass. In burial 77, The wooden backing that held the whole arrangement together rotted down into a smear, and the 7 carved pieces stayed exactly where a pair of hands had set them, because ivory outlasts everything else a person can make. The face is intact. It is the only part of that child that is... Number 1. The skulls that became portraits. In 2009, an object from the British Museum was taken to the Natural History Museum in London and put through a micro-CT scanner. From the outside, it looks like a head, a smooth plaster face, slightly flattened with 2 pale shells where the eyes belong, and a strange compression to the lower half, as though the chin had been pushed up into the mouth. The scan looked underneath the plaster. Inside is a human skull, a specific one. The person was an adult, over 40, and probably male, although the bone carries mixed traits and the museum's own wording stops short of certainty. As a child, the head had been bound, and the varying thickness of the bone records a skull reshaped while it still grew. There is a broken nose that healed. Both first molars are broken, the second and third are missing, one incisor is gone, and there are abscesses in the jaw. The lower jaw is not there at all, which is why the face looks compressed. The plaster was modeled onto a cranium with no mandible, and the modeler closed the gap by shortening the face. Inside the brain case, someone had packed damp, gritty soil and then pressed in a finer plug of clay. A section of bone at the back had been cut away to do it, then refitted over the opening. The clay still holds their thumbprints. The skull came out of Tel es Sultan, ancient Jericho, in 1953. Excavated by Kathleen Kenyon, she found 7 of them together, cached beneath a plaster floor. The British Museum dates it to between 8,200 and 7,500 BC, around 9,500 years ago. In the pre-pottery Neolithic, before writing, before metal, at the point where human beings were still working out what a permanent settlement was. And it was not one town's habit. Modeled skulls have come from Kfar HaHorish and Yiftahel from Tel Ramad in Syria, from Ein Ghazal in Jordan, from Kosk Hoyuk in Anatolia. A survey by Michel Bonagovsky counted 73 across 8 sites, and more have been published since. The method is consistent enough to recognize and local enough to argue about. The lower jaw is usually removed first. Lime plaster is applied directly onto the bone in layers and modeled into a face. At Jericho and Beis Amun, shells go into the eye sockets. At Ein Ghazal, the eyes are built up in plaster instead. At Nahal Himar, the skulls were not given faces at all. They were coated across the crown with a black organic material laid down in a lattice of rolled cords crossing at a sharp angle. For decades, it was called bitumen. A chemical study in 2016 identified it instead as a resin from the styrax tree, the earliest known use of a fragrant plant resin anywhere. The truly haunting part is who these people were. The story that attached itself to these skulls was that they were patriarchs, venerated male ancestors, heads of founding households. Bonagovsky's count does not support it. Of the 7326 are adult males, 15 are adult females, 14 are juveniles, and the rest could not be assigned an age or a sex at all. Juveniles. Plaster was modeled onto the skulls of children. That is the most disturbing correction in the literature. What the practice was for is inference, but the inference has evidence under it. Headless skeletons turn up in burials of the same period at the same sites, so the skull was taken from a body, then buried without it. The finished heads tilt backwards, consistent with being propped up to be looked at, and the Jericho 7 ended together, under a floor in a building where people were living. Beyond that, the record thins. Whether any skull stood in a house for years is not documented, and no evidence shows that any was ever replastered. This is where the whole countdown arrives. Across 9,000 years and 4 continents in societies with no contact with one another, the same act keeps surfacing in whatever material would not rot. In gold and stone, in wood and hair, in clay and ash and bronze and plaster and ivory. None of these faces could be worn by a living person, and that is not an accident of design. A mask worn by the living hides a face. Every object in this countdown was made to replace one. Except at Jericho, the plaster is not a covering at all. The mask and the person are the same object. There is nothing underneath, because the plaster is the face, modeled straight onto the bone of somebody who had been alive by people who knew him. They had watched his nose heal crooked. They had watched his teeth fail one at a time. And they could not accept that his head should stop being a head. 9,500 years later, a scanner found their thumbprints in the clay they had pushed into his skull. A reconstruction team modeled the missing jaw from another Neolithic cranium of the right size and date and gave the face back a face. We have been doing this for as long as we have been us. The impulse to keep hold of a face is older than farming villages, older than writing, older than any belief system you can put a name to. It is one of the very few things every culture in this list worked out alone, and they all reached the same conclusion. A body can be allowed to go. A face has to be kept in something that will not rot, by hands that will... If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.